Yo, what is up guys, I'm Spear and today we're building some house stabs like these. Even if you don't enjoy this particular patch, it might be a good idea to watch this tutorial anyway, because there are some cool tricks that went into making this patch that might help you out even when tackling other sound design problems. So without further ado, let's take a look at the individual elements that make up this sound. And as you can see, I have 3 mixer channels going here, and each one of them has a different function in this patch. The first one, the Thor one, is our synth body. And as you can hear, this synth patch has a bit of an attack, so it fades in, there is no proper transient. The transient gets handled by the red drum 1 over here. And as you can hear, that is just a simple click, and it is the same for every one of our stabs. And that's kind of important, because when you're building a stab patch and you're just using a single synth, it can be quite hard to get a good transient and a good synth body out of that single synth. Because when you're playing melodies, the transients change as well as they change in pitch. And this is the whole idea behind this patch, where we are splitting the synth body from the transient, so that we have a reliable transient that is the same on every stab, that clicks the same all the time, so we don't mess up the transient when we play a weird melody or a new kind of chord. And yeah, that's kind of the whole idea behind this patch, splitting the transient and the synth body. Last but not least, we also have a reverb layer. And we have this on its own mix channel for a couple of reasons, which we'll get into later. But first up, let's get into rebuilding this patch. So we will start off by chucking in a Thor, which will be our synth body. In the programmer, we can keep the analog oscillator, but we'll switch it to a triangle wave. Then we'll reduce the frequency on the low pass filter all the way, bring up the envelope amount all the way, and reduce the velocity all the way. Now we will use the filter envelope to actually make this a stab patch, and to do this we will reduce the sustain all the way. We will also have the attack all the way down on the filter envelope. Then we will reduce the decay to about 700 milliseconds and the release to about 550 milliseconds. And already we have a nice stab going. Next up we will work the amp envelope so that our stab is a little bit tighter and has just the slightest bit of attack. So on the attack, we will bring it up to 3.9 milliseconds. You can use shift to be more accurate when setting this value. I'm choosing like about 4 milliseconds because this way we have just the slightest fade in. We don't have a proper transient, but when we hit a key on our keyboard, the chord comes in basically at the same time. So we have a very, very short attack, which gets rid of our transient, but we can still jam out using this patch. And it isn't like a pad that takes ages to fade in. Next up, we will bring down the decay to about 250 milliseconds, so that's really short and snappy. We will reduce the sustain all the way, and we will bring up the release to about 500 milliseconds-ish. Alright. So we have some nice and snappy stabs without a big transient. Because triangle waves are not the loudest waves there are, and because using a filter envelope will reduce the volume even more, we will bring up the drive on the low pass filter a bit to about 92, so we have a bit more volume to play with in the processing chain to come. Alright, talking of processing chain, the first effect that we will apply to this Thor is a vocoder. Now you might be wondering why we're chugging in a vocoder right here. And reasons vocoder is actually quite cool because we can switch it to equalizer mode. This way we have a nice equalizer, which also has some nifty functions and does some cool stuff to our signal. When we reduce the band count all the way to 4 and bring up the shift to 1, we get some subtle saturation, which can be very nice, especially on basses and leads. So I suggest you try that out. I'm using this here on this triangle stab as well, mainly because I did that in my remix for Bedobos When I Cry, where I used this stab patch initially, and I was just applying vocoders to everything back then. But it's just a pretty cool saturation. It's pretty subtle on a triangle wave patch. You basically can't hear it because there's so little harmonic input that the vocoder has a hard time generating harmonic output off of that. But it still does some work. You can hear that there's a bit more to the sound with the vocoder applied, but we are going to make use of its equalizer function now anyway, so it's definitely not for nothing. We will reduce the low band a little bit. Then we will reduce the low mids by quite a lot. We can leave the high mids as they are, but we're going to boost the highs just a bit. This isn't going to do much because there aren't many highs in this signal anyway, but it's just gonna be an ever so slightly more crispy sound afterwards. Alright, let's move on and create an echo unit. This is just there to fill out the silences between the steps and have the whole thing sound a bit more fluent. And so we'll have the effect be quite subtle. We will reduce the dry wet to about 16%, and we will bring down the time to 1/16. So it's quite a quick delay. It's rather like a little tail coming after each step. We will bring up the feedback to about 60%, and we have a nice tail going. We can apply some more cool stuff to the delay using the echo's functionalities like the ping pong. Turning this on, we can control how hard this ping pong pans the signal. So using the pan knob and bringing it to about -25 will pan the first delay cycle by 25 to the left and the second delay cycle by 25 to the right, and so on. So this way we don't have the extreme ping pong effect. We have just a subtle stereo wobble. So we have a bit more of a stereo image for this kind of patch, and it'll sound a bit cooler on headphones especially. We can also turn on the filter. This filter only affects the delayed signal, of course, so we're not messing with our initial step. And you can basically set this wherever you want. If you set it at a high frequency value, you get like a high frequency stutter as a delay. If you bring it down to a low frequency value, you get a more subdued delay. I like the low frequencies on this patch, but you should choose a value that pleases you. Alright, next up we will chuck in an EQ, and we will shape the frequency spectrum of the signal some more. We will use parameter 1 at about 250 Hz and reduce some frequencies there, because triangle wave steps are very low mid heavy, so reducing some frequencies there will restore some balance to the triangle wave. Right, next up we have quite a bit of a high frequency hiss at about 2.5K. You can hear it doesn't sound that nice. So we will reduce those frequencies as well with a slightly higher Q, so we have a more sharp, kind of sharp hole right here. Just makes the whole thing sound a lot smoother. We will chuck in another EQ, where we'll use parameter 1 to reduce some more low mids at around 330 Hz. You can really hear that with all those low mids, reducing those makes the whole thing sound a bit more pleasant. And then we'll use the low shelf to get rid of the lows, basically. So we'll bring down the gain by quite a bit. We can bring up the Q a little. And then with the frequency, we can adjust where the reduction starts. So at about 100 Hz, we have so that all the frequencies below 100 Hz get reduced by our gain amount, which we will keep at about -10. Cool, that's all we need to do to our frequency spectrum. Next up, we will apply some Scream 4 distortion. Now, we will just use the Scream 4 to saturate the signal a little bit, because we have cut out a lot of harmonics using equalizers, and the signal can sound quite thin after EQing so harshly. So using a Scream 4 or any other distortion or saturation unit for that matter, we can get some harmonics back into the signal, and we will use the tape distortion algorithm, and we will bring up P1 all the way, and we will reduce the damage to about 20. you can hear that the thing sounds a lot, or the steps sound a lot more alive, so to speak, when run through a saturation like the Scream 4, while they've sounded pretty weak and thin without the saturation. It's not that prominent on this patch, as it is quite a thin patch, but that's the whole thrill of having this kind of small step, so to speak. It's not that big super saw step that would really benefit from saturation. It's rather subdued, subtle, and yeah, but that's why we like it, right? Next up, we're pretty much done in the rack. We will just chuck in a filter, which will come in handy in the sequencer in just a second. For now, we will just bring down all the things that aren't frequency to 0 and bring up the frequency to 127, and then alt-click it to create an automation line in the sequencer. Right, but in the rack, we are pretty much done. We will need to switch back. Now, of course, there's no reverb yet. That we will handle that later on. Reverb is, of course, one of the main features of this kind of step. But having that in an own mix channel gives us a lot more control. So for now, we will just keep this patch as it is and take a look in the sequencer and take a look at the note material that we are going to feed to this Thor. So I'll just copy over this clip and take a look at it. Now, the first thing you'll notice when I play this back is that there are some additional steps. And those are there because this is actually quite a cool trick to do. We want a little bit of a fade in for our initial steps for each phrase. And for this, we will use the filter that we've just created, the low pass filter down here. We will just draw in a clip underneath this additional step, open this clip up, and then we will bring the frequency up from all the way down when this initial additional step hits to all the way up when we want our actual steps to come in. This way we have this slight fade in from our first step that we don't actually want the listener to hear. We just want the fade in. We just want the release to come up as the frequency goes up. This creates this cool kind of emerging effect, which again isn't that prominent on a triangle wave, but when you try that on a super saw step patch, you get some pretty huge fade-ins. Right, I forgot to solo. So those fade-ins are quite nice, and it's those little subtle details that make your step patch really stand out. Right, cool, so that's that for our Thor. Next up, we want some transients. Like I said, having the transients on an additional mix channel gives us a lot more control, and we are going to chuck in a red drum right now, which will serve as our transient, and we automatically get our mix channel. Right. So for our transient, we want a clicky kind of sound, and I did some digging in the factory sound bank, and I found that a certain bell sample has quite a nice transient. So if you go into the Kong patches, the Kong sounds and samples, and search for bell, the BL404 bell BL has this kind of nice and clicky transient, which is exactly what we need. So we will pull this up into our first strip on the red drum. And what we're going to do now is hit edit sample and bring up this left marker just a little bit, because as you can see, the transient isn't initially there. It's a little bit of a fade in right here, which we don't want for our transient right here. So we will bring up this marker just a bit so we have an actual transient, no fade in, as the first thing in our sample. We click save, and we have a nice and clicky sound. Next up, we're going to reduce the length to 0, which leaves us with this click. And this is exactly what we want out of this red drum. We just want a single click, which will serve as our transient. And on its own, it sounds, yeah, I don't need to say how it sounds. It sounds very boring. But having a synth body and reverb follow after it make this whole thing sound good. And that's the whole idea. As you can see up here, we still need to apply some processing to this to make it sound a bit cleaner, and if we want something to sound clean, we use equalizers to cut out the dirty stuff. And I'm just going to use the upper equalizers as reference here. We're cutting out a couple of frequencies at about 800 Hertz, which is kind of this resonant, I don't really know how to describe it, it's kind of a pop right here. And reducing this pop just balances the whole click out a little bit more and makes it less obnoxious, I should say. And we're getting rid of some high frequencies as well at about 6.7K, which is right about here. Yeah, those are just some ringing high frequencies, which are not nice. So kill those. We are getting rid of some of the character of this transient, so it's just a generic click, but that's exactly what we want out of it. So yeah. We will use another equalizer to get rid of some very high frequencies at about 10K. Should be fine. Yeah, 12K. I guess there's just some noise up there. Yeah, another kind of high ringing frequency that we don't want in this transient. Bringing this down just makes it a bit cleaner. Alright, now that we have our transient patch all set up, we can get back into the sequencer. Let's pull this one down. And I'll just quickly demonstrate how you would go about now making so that every time a step hits, we also have our transient hit. It's quite simple. We'll just copy over this patch, open up the clip, or copy over this clip, open it up, then just select all the notes. Sorry. We will then make them so every note is on the same, so that every note is on the same note by hitting this little equality sign next to the note. Then pitching that down to C1 leaves us with a nice clip, which we can now move over to the red drum lane. When opening this up, we still have to delete some of the clicks where we have the fade-ins. So as you can see, this right here isn't even a step. We'll get rid of the click, otherwise it'll sound weird. So just get rid of that, and that one, and that one. Those were all the fade-ins. And you can hear we already have our step going. Of course, mixing this is a bit more intricate than mixing other things, because now you're actually mixing a single sound with two different mix channels. So you'll have to make sure that the balance is on point. I think we should reduce the transient a little bit and have the synth body come out a bit more. But of course, this is again your personal preference. If you want a really clicky step, you can go for it by just bringing up the transient and reducing the synth body. Cool. Another thing that you might want to do, especially if you have some kind of build-up mechanic in your step. And speaking of that, let's just quickly build that. When we alt-click the envelope amount in our low-pass filter on our synth body, we get an automation line in the sequencer, which we can now use to create this kind of build-up effect. So let's have this one go from 90 all the way up to 127. And let's take a listen to what that does. It's this very nice feeling of an emerging kind of step sound, but as you've probably heard, the transient doesn't sound good when our step sounds are subdued. They are too loud and too clicky when our synth body is quite low. An easy way to fix this is opening up the MIDI clip of our transients and just changing the velocities down here so that when our synth sounds are low, our transients are low as well, and they rise with our envelope automation along the lines of this. This way we can adapt the velocity curve of our transients so they fit the style of our synth body better. Right, that's that. Last but not least, let's take care of the reverb. For the reverb, simply right-click on the mix channel of your synth body and hit Create Parallel Channel. And let me just solo that. So the first thing that we will actually chuck into this parallel channel is in the utilities an audio merger and splitter. We're doing this because we want to create a setup where our reverb is reduced in volume every time a new step comes in, so that the focus from the listener is on the steps and not on the reverb tail. This is classic sidechaining, and we can achieve this by using an audio splitter, taking the 2 device from our mix channel into the splitter input, and then let's just flip the rack back around and create a reverb unit while holding down Shift, as well as a compressor while also holding down Shift. Flipping the rack back around, we can now connect one of the outputs of the splitter into the reverb. Then from the reverb, we'll go into the compressor. Out of the compressor, we will go back into the mix channel. But now we can use another output of the splitter for our sidechain in. Now the wet signal out of the reverb gets sidechained by the dry signal that also goes into the reverb. What does that all mean? Well, let's take a listen. First up, we'll use some very radical settings on our compressor. So the threshold all the way down at -36, the ratio at infinite to 1. We will reduce the attack on the compressor as well. And now let's take a listen to what that does. You can see that this ducks the signal every time a new step comes in. If we solo the step as well, you can hear the effect. Using the parameters on the compressor, we can change the way this ducking happens. For example, bringing up the threshold reduces the effect so that the reverb is more even. It doesn't get reduced by that much. And using the release, we can choose how quickly the reverb comes in after a step happened. Let's just have a quick A/B comparison of what this whole thing sounds like without this sidechain compression, so you know why we do that kind of stuff. Especially when there's not that much harmonic material coming into the reverb, having a big reverb tail that is not sidechain compressed will drown out the next step. And we talked about that a lot in the latest reverb tutorials, like controlling reverb tails on synth and drums. So I'm not going to go into detail on why this is bad right now. But yeah, this is just the setup that I used in the remix so that my reverb is nice and in check and controlled. Speaking of reverb, let's make a couple of adjustments to how this reverb sounds by opening up the programmer, switching up the algorithm to convolution, bringing up the size to 10, which makes the whole thing a bit bigger. Yeah. And then we'll use the dry wet to bring that. No, we will not bring that down. Sorry. I have a little bit of a brain freeze going on right now. We are in a parallel channel that is only our reverb, so we want the dry wet to be all the way up at 127. But we can choose the decay to be a bit longer at about 92, so that our reverb plays out nicely. We can also use the damp and high EQ knobs to change the way this reverb sounds. Bringing down the damp and bringing up the high EQ will introduce more high frequencies into our reverb and make it sound a bit more exciting. There are a couple of things that this reverb still needs though, and it sounds a bit overwhelming. And to fix that, we will just chuck in an EQ, and I'll just quickly reference the EQ settings up here. Yeah, we're getting rid of the lows, reducing some mids, and reducing some high ringing frequencies. So let's get right into that. Kill the lows by having a parameter with the frequency all the way down, the gain all the way down, and quite a low Q. This parameter will just reduce the lows by quite a bit. We can also use the low shelf to help it out a bit. And then we will also reduce the low mids at about something like 500 Hertz. Now let's take a listen to how that sounds. Already the reverb sounds a lot nicer and not as overwhelming. We will use another equalizer to get rid of a high frequency ringing up at about 10K. You can hear that these high frequency ringing sounds in reverbs, those are not pleasant at all. So let's just kill that right away. And we got a nice reverb tail going. This is one of the other benefits of having your reverb in an individual mix channel. You can apply normal effects that you would use on synth patches as well, just to the reverb, like the M-class equalizer. But you could also get even more creative right here. Let's just take a quick second to maybe apply a frequency shifter to the reverb channel, which is something which should sound quite cool. I'm using the Echo Boat, which is the hands down the best frequency shifter that I've ever used. It's a rack extension. I think it's not that expensive, so if you need a frequency shifter, you should look into that one. We can just bring up the amount on the LFO, which will just introduce a slight wobble into our reverb. Things got a little bit out of hand pretty quickly, but you get where I'm coming from. Having a reverb channel in your mix makes things a lot easier, but also opens up more creative possibilities. So consider having all your reverb in individual mix channels. Yeah, but if you're lazy like me, you probably won't do it and just slap in a reverb unit into your rack and be done with it, which is fine as well. Alright, that's pretty much all there is to it. Let's take a quick listen to what we came up with today, and then we'll sign off. Cool. I hope this tutorial was useful. If it was, please do drop a like. That helps out a lot and makes me happy as well. Alright, I'll see you next time. Have a good one of whatever you're having.